There's a number that most working professionals spend years trying to reach. Six figures. $100,000 a year. It sits in the culture as a kind of financial finish line, the point where money problems are supposed to end and real financial progress is supposed to begin. But something strange happens to a lot of people who cross that line. They don't start saving more. In many cases, they start saving less. Not because they become reckless, not because they stop caring, but because the structure of a six-figure life is quietly engineered to consume exactly what it provides. That's not a metaphor, it's a pattern. And it's worth understanding before it runs for a decade unchecked. Most people believe that saving is primarily an income problem. Earn too little, and you can't save. Earn enough, and saving becomes automatic, almost inevitable. Under this logic, someone making $50,000 struggles because the math is tight. Someone making $120,000 shouldn't struggle at all. The margins should be obvious. The surplus should be sitting right there waiting to be captured. And from the outside, it certainly looks that way. In countries like the US, UK, Canada, and Australia, a six-figure household income places you above the national median. In many areas, well above it. Friends and family may view you as someone who has it figured out. You may view yourself that way too. But then you check your savings at the end of the year, and the number is either disappointingly small or, in some cases, hasn't moved at all. You're not drowning, you're not in crisis. But you're also not building, and that quiet absence of progress, despite a strong income, creates a specific kind of confusion that's hard to talk about openly. Because how do you explain that you earned six figures and still feel like you're barely getting ahead? This is where the trap begins. Not at the bottom of the income ladder, right in the middle of what most people consider the comfortable zone. Let's look at how six-figure income actually behaves once it enters real life. Start with $120,000. A clean, recognizable number, solidly six figures. In most developed English-speaking economies, this income attracts a meaningful tax burden. Income tax, social contributions, mandatory deductions. Figures vary depending on country, region, and individual circumstances, but generally speaking, the effective take-home might land somewhere between $80,000 and $95,000. That's your real starting point, not $120,000. Something closer to $87,000 or $90,000, depending on where you live and how your deductions are structured. Now apply housing. In any major metropolitan area, the kind of city where $120,000 salaries are most commonly earned, housing is aggressive. Rent or mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, maintenance. A reasonable estimate in many of these markets might be $24,000 to $36,000 a year. Sometimes more. After taxes and housing, you may be working with $55,000 to $65,000 for everything else. Transportation comes next. In car-dependent regions, vehicle payments, insurance, fuel, and maintenance can easily account for $6,000 to $10,000 annually. In cities with public transit, the cost is lower, but it rarely disappears entirely. Then the essentials: groceries, utilities, phone and internet, health insurance premiums or out-of-pocket medical expenses, child care or education costs, which in many areas represent one of the largest household expenses of all. By this point, a six-figure earner has committed perhaps 75 to 85% of their take-home pay to non-discretionary obligations. Not luxuries, obligations. What remains, the actual discretionary margin, might be $10,000 to $18,000 a year. That's the real number. And here's what makes it a trap. That margin is small enough to be fragile, but large enough to feel like freedom. It creates the illusion of surplus without delivering the scale needed for meaningful accumulation. A single unexpected expense, a car repair, a medical bill, a home maintenance issue, can erase months of whatever savings trickled through. And then there's the layer most people underestimate, the social cost of earning six figures. At this income level, your environment shifts. Your colleagues, your neighborhood, your children's school community, they all operate at a certain standard. The restaurants you frequent, the trips you take, the clothes you wear to the office. None of these are extravagant in isolation, but they are calibrated to match the world you now inhabit. And opting out of them carries social friction that most people would rather avoid. This is the mechanism of the trap. It doesn't look like overspending. It looks like normal life at a price point that leaves almost nothing behind. The structural math is one part of this, but the psychology is where the trap truly locks in. When someone crosses into six-figure territory, there's often an internal narrative shift. They feel correctly that they've reached a meaningful milestone. They've outearned their parents, their younger selves, perhaps many of their peers. That achievement creates a sense of financial arrival, the feeling that the hard part is behind them. But that feeling is deceptive, because while the income has grown, the savings behavior hasn't been restructured to match. The same percentage that wasn't saved at $70,000 still isn't being saved at $120,000. The gap between income and spending didn't widen, it just moved up. There's also a subtler psychological dynamic at work. At lower income levels, the constraint is visible. You know you can't afford something. The boundary is clear. At six figures, the constraint becomes invisible. You can technically afford most individual purchases. The problem isn't any single expense. It's the aggregate. And aggregates are hard to feel in real time. You don't notice lifestyle inflation as it happens. You notice it 18 months later when you realize your spending baseline has shifted by $15,000 a year, and you can't quite identify where it went. This is why hirers so often describe feeling stuck despite earning well. The income should theoretically create freedom. Instead, it creates a more expensive version of the same constraint. Bills met, obligations covered, but no meaningful surplus translating into lasting wealth. The paradox is specific and quiet. Earning more didn't solve the problem. It camouflaged it behind a higher standard of living. Breaking out of this pattern doesn't require earning more. It requires seeing the structure for what it is. The first shift is recognizing that six figures is not a wealth indicator. It's an income indicator. Those are fundamentally different measurements. One describes what flows through your accounts. The other describes what stays. Treating a high salary as evidence of financial health is like measuring fitness by how much food you consume rather than what your body actually retains and uses. The second shift is understanding that your savings rate, not your income level, determines your trajectory. Generally speaking, someone earning $90,000 who consistently saves 20% of their take-home pay will likely build more wealth over time than someone earning $150,000 who saves 3%. The math on this is not close, and it doesn't require complex projections to see why. The third shift is perhaps the most important. The discretionary margin has to be treated as the first allocation, not the last. In most six-figure households, savings is what's left over after everything else is accounted for. That ordering guarantees a small and inconsistent result. Reversing it, deciding the margin first and building the lifestyle around what remains, changes the entire financial trajectory without requiring any additional income. This isn't about austerity. It's about sequence, where savings sits in the order of operations matters more than the income number at the top. And finally, the social cost of earning well has to be evaluated honestly, not eliminated. Evaluated. There's a difference between spending that genuinely supports your quality of life and spending that exists only because your income level made it available. Learning to distinguish between the two is one of the most underrated financial skills a high earner can develop. Six figures was supposed to be the answer. For a lot of people, it became the most sophisticated version of the problem. Not because the money isn't real, it is. Not because the work isn't valuable, it absolutely is. But because the structure surrounding high income, the taxes, the cost of living, the social expectations, the invisible inflation of daily life, absorbs almost everything unless a deliberate counterforce is in place. The trap isn't that you can't save. It's that nothing in your environment requires you to. And by the time you notice, years of earning power are passed through without leaving much behind. Seeing that clearly is where it starts to change. This is the wealth paradox.